box for asking questions during the Q&A session. Um, and the session is being recorded. And if you would like to have a copy, please email Dr. Susan Sabatini and the email here, and we'll post it in the chat box. So today, actually, we are wrapping up our symposium for this year. We had 3 sessions before. All the sessions will be posted on our YouTube channel. And today, it's just we tried this year to have kind of a retrospective of all the major food safety issues and major food safety pathogens, and have very insightful actually talks in the past 3 sessions. And today, actually, we are going to talk on another interesting one. Before I talk about that, I just would like to, for those of you who don't know about the Guelph Food Safety Seminar, we are a partnership in agri-food safety. We are representative from different national and municipal and provincial institutions. As you can see here, we have AFC, we have the University of Guelph, we have Health Canada, NSF, OMAFRA, and CFIA, and BHAC, and CFI. Today's session is titled When Making a Sandwich Became a Hazard, the Listeria Outbreak in Deli Meat. And for sure, the title actually give you an idea about the this session, how it will be interesting for many people today. Today, as I mentioned, I'll be moderating the session along with Michelle Martin. She's a manager at Health Protection Division, Durham Region Health Department. And we have also Paul Mediors, manager and environmental health at Wellington Dufferin Guelph Public Health. And both of them are for sure among the GFSS organizing committee members. We have 2 speakers today. We will start with Dr. Randy Hoffman. He's the Chief Food Safety and Sustainability Officer at Maple Leaf Foods. Since joining Maple Leaf in 2009, he has held many positions of leadership, with his current role encompassing food safety and quality, environmental sustainability, animal care, and occupational health and safety. Among his many accomplishments, he has served as president of the American Meat Institute prior to joining Maple Leaf. He holds a PhD and Masters of Science degree in Meat and Animal Science from the University of Florida. With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hoffman for his talk. So the floor is yours, Randy. So Michelle, if you can just share the slides, I will unshare mine.
Thank you very much, Annie, and I'm honored to join today on the 20th version of this seminar series. Thank you to Paul and Michelle as well, and all the organizers for including myself and giving me an opportunity to represent my colleagues at Maple Leaf Foods as we share our story about what happened to Maple Leaf Foods about 15 years ago. A provocative title to the seminar series today, and I look forward also to hearing from Dr. Oliver from Purdue later on with some of her technical insights. We've worked closely with Dr. Oliver over the years, and I look forward to hearing her remarks as well. So I'd like to start off by just saying that I would guess that there are some people on the line today. It looks like, close to 68, 70 people, maybe more will join. Some of you have probably heard this Maple Leaf Listeria outbreak story before. Certainly, I have told the story numerous times in public forums, and I'm proud to do that. I'm proud to do it because of the actions we've taken since the event. I'm also thankful to have the opportunity to share our story because I know that it can have an impact on the safety of food in the future. And that's the reason we continue to emphasize the learnings that we had during this tragic event in 2008. So today, I want to give a high-level overview of that story from 2008. And I really want to touch on 3 things from that. One is is an overview of the commitments that we made as a result of that tragedy in 2008. Second, I want to share with you some insights that we have learned as an operating company in the ready-to-eat food sector. And I say food, not just meat protein, but also we operate in the alternative protein space as well, and I've learned a lot in those facilities. So I want to share insights on Listeria control. And then in the third and concluding topic I want to share with you today is about leadership and culture and how important people are to ensuring the safety of food manufacturing. And so those three topics we'll cover in my short presentation today. If you could go to the next slide, Michelle, thank you. For those that don't know Maple Leaf Foods, a quick overview. We are about almost $5 billion in revenue. In 2023, we'll be close to $5 billion in Canadian revenue, with around 14,000 employees across 31 manufacturing facilities, about 23 food manufacturing plants, as well as feed mills and hatcheries on our poultry side. We raise about 4 million hogs in Manitoba, across a network of over 100 facilities and close to 200 barns. We're quite proud of some of the work we've done to raise the good in food. Our primary mission is to raise the good in food and to become we have a vision to become the most sustainable protein company on earth. It's a very aggressive and aspirational goal that we have at the company. One of the things that we do is produce a lot of pork and poultry without antibiotics during production. And so that's something we could certainly talk a lot about, but we're proud of the work that we've done to reduce our antibiotic use through the animal production side in both pork and poultry. And as I mentioned, we've also made a significant investment in our plant protein business, operating now 3 facilities in the United States. And we have leading market share in our categories in a business that we're quite proud of and continue to see it grow. You can see a scattering of the brands. We're a family of brands, with Maple Leaf and Schneider's being 2 of our flagship brands, and our Greenfield Natural Meat Company growing rapidly, especially in the United States. So I wanted to briefly give you that overview of who we are today. Next slide, please. But the purpose of today's talk is to reflect on the past, and it's a very sobering reflection. One that at Maple Leaf Foods, if you're an employee here, you'll know that we reflect on this frequently. I have colleagues in the company that think about this nearly every day as they come to work, as they think about their job, as they make decisions in producing food every day. We reflect on the tragedy that occurred in 2008. We also use that event as a reminder once a year, when we commemorate on roughly around August 23rd, every year we commemorate what happened in August of 2008. We reflect on the past, but we also celebrate the things that we've done as a result of that, and we think about the future. And it's always a moment in our annual calendar for the company to gather and to collectively reflect on the past. And it's an important time period for us. I want to share with you, as part of that commemoration event, we produced a video several years ago, capturing the stories and the emotions of many of the Maple Leaf employees that worked in the company in various roles across the business. We captured that on video to share with future generations, to share with new employees, and hopefully you'll find it impactful. So Michelle, if you could go to the next slide and run the video.
In health news tonight, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has issued a warning over potentially contaminated meat distributed by Maple Leaf Foods. Health officials confirmed they are investigating at least 4 deaths in Ontario related to Listeria. A Maple Leaf Foods plant in Toronto is linked to the outbreak.
20 people died during the listeriosis outbreak.
Remembering what happened in 2008 is a critical point in our calendar every year. 23 people died from eating products that we produced that they expected to be safe.
Certainly, it was the most terrible thing in the time that I've been at this company. But it was also, as we worked our way through, it became one of our defining moments as a company. And I think the response from leadership around how we were going to handle it that early really set the tone for the organization.
You know, Michael McCain's leadership was instrumental in leading the company through the events of 2008.
I think people recognized that we had a colossal failure, but that, the only path forward was to handle that failure in a responsible and a proactive way.
I absolutely do not believe that this is a failure of the Canadian food safety system or the regulators. Certainly knowing that there is a desire to assign blame, I want to reiterate that the buck stops right here.
It was an emotional moment. When I first came to the Barter Road facility back in 2008, every individual that I met with was clearly emotionally impacted.
2008 had a major, profound, and emotional impact on me personally. It's really hard to have that in your history.
I was very shocked and concerned and was wondering what was going to happen next.
The day that it was confirmed that the product came from Barter kind of forever be etched in my mind. Nobody really talked. We stayed there for a considerable amount of time, and it turned to, heavy grief. We thought an awful lot about the victims and their families, and it was a tough day, to say the least.
It was a very tough time for everybody, and everybody had to process it their own way. Some people processed it well, and some people didn't. Inside our company, I think it took a huge personal toll on a lot of people. Like, they just were so desperate to fix it.
For the years to come, there was absolutely a company shift. It was not a one-function approach. It was a massive undertaking to build food safety in all the business processes. All aspects of the way we brought products to market had to shift to incorporate food safety into it.
From a reflective standpoint, as I think about it now, 15 years later, it led to such important changes in the way we operate.
Made food safety the essence of our culture in a way that provided meaning to that tragedy and the loss of life on our watch.
Values in any company are important. Here it's not just a poster on the wall. It's literally how we work and how we behave when we come together to work every day. And I think that's a big part of how we got up. We took accountability for what happened. We committed that we would do everything we possibly could to ensure a tragedy like that never happened again under our watch, ever. We committed that food safety would not be a competitive topic in our industry, and that we would share anything we learned and any knowledge we could possibly gain with anyone who was interested, in the spirit of making the industry better. And that commitment certainly holds today.
It'll be something that sticks with us for a long time. And that's okay. We've taken responsibility, and I think it's our mantle to hold that we've been able to come through that whole experience and be a much better company for it.
To me, food safety is an organizational mindset. It's not just a task that is assigned to a specific department. So I see it as a mindset that must permeate every aspect of the work that we do. I joined in Maple Leaf in 2019, and I immediately discovered the dedication and commitment that people have towards food safety.
Everyone understands how important and how crucial it is for our industry to ensure that we're making consumer food safe.
We have constant changes in our plants. We have constant changes to equipment and processes, and we always have to manage those risks. And that's exactly what it is. It's always a risk, and it always has to be mitigated in the best way we can do it.
We have a food safety culture that's embedded throughout our manufacturing processes. And what we need to do as a company is we need to continue to educate people.
So whether that be cooking to proper internal temperatures, how to store product, in the fridges, the importance of expiry dates. It's crucial that we protect our consumers, and our consumers are our families, our friends, and our loved ones.
Just being at Maple Leaf has opened my eyes to the importance and the significance of the role we all play at Maple Leaf to ensure that millions of people each day can enjoy delicious, quality protein in a really safe way.
Food safety in the Maple Leaf organization is more than a function or a process for the company. It really is a commitment.
So our commitment to continuous improvement requires that we constantly reflect back on what's happened.
Every year, around the same time in August, around August 23rd, we have an annual commemoration, and we do an event on that day. But leading up to that event, we also have talks and presentations to orient people, to remind them of what happened, but also what they do every single day in their job and why it matters.
Our promise and our commitment is that we never forget. And the best way that we can honor those that were impacted by 2008 is to remind ourselves the commitments we made to ourselves, to our company, to the people who eat our food, and never allow ourselves to become complacent. And that means that every single person inside of Maple Leaf has to be deeply committed to food safety. And that's just an important part of our culture today.
Well, hopefully that was a meaningful message from many employees in our company, both teammates that were here during the 2008 crisis. You heard from Ian Stewart, who's now our Chief Supply Chain Officer. Of course, you heard from Michael McCain, who today is our Executive Chairman of the Board, and more recently our CEO, Curtis Frank, who joined in that role, or took on that role just this year. Curtis was the last voice you heard there, and he's taken up the mantle from Michael as our senior leader, and ensuring that we never forget. Curtis was in sales when this event happened back in 2008, and he's as committed as any one of us to what we need to do to make food safe every day. If you could go to the next slide. One of the things that guided us through that tragedy and that crisis and in the moment were our Maple Leaf leadership values that you can see on the screen here. And I won't go through each of the 8 values, but I can tell you that they did guide our decision making, and it made things somewhat easier. It made things possible to manage through when we could look on the wall and see the poster on the wall, and look at each other in the eyes and make decisions based on the values. And these helped guide us during the crisis itself, but have also guided us effectively for the last 15 years. And so I like to start with a quick recognition of the importance of the company values. We'll talk in a few minutes about how food safety culture gets embedded within those values as we operate every day. Next slide, please. So I want to start, as I mentioned, I'm going to really cover 3 things rather briefly here, and then we'll get over to Dr. Oliver. But I want to talk about our commitments. I want to talk about some insights we've had on how to control Listeria in a ready-to-eat processing facility. And then third, talk about insights on leadership and culture. So next slide. The first thing we did in 2009, as we began to think about how to react to this terrible tragedy, was to make public commitments. And this is what we call our safety promise. There are 7 core elements, core commitments that have been in place since 2009, and we continue to emphasize this safety promise each and every day. They really touch on some important concepts for me in terms of leadership and culture and people, measuring ourselves and benchmarking against others that have been successful, benchmarking with other industries. As an example, at a symposium a couple of years ago, we invited in an engineer from Boeing who talked about safety and the behaviors that are required to produce an aircraft safely are very similar to the behaviors that we need to embrace to produce food safely. So we constantly measure ourselves against others, and we seek to continuously improve. And just like giving the seminar today, and the many others that I've done along with my colleagues have done, we are open and honest to share our learnings with others because we know we can always learn something from someone else. And so that really reflects our public facing commitments. In addition, next slide, please, we made some really important, set some really important internal goals and a formal strategy that we launched in 2009, which is reflected on the left side of the screen, which really embodied our strategy on a page. Previous slide. Yeah, with a vision to always provide consumers safe, great tasting food produced in a safe work environment. We've linked the concept of human people safety, employee safety with food safety because behaviors are very similar. Taking time to think, making sure we use data to make decisions, being disciplined in our approach to decision making. You know, these behaviors are very similar, whether we're talking about the safety of our employees or the safety of the food we make. We refreshed our strategy in 2017 with much of the same focus, but a new commitment in several areas. And then more recently, I don't have it on the slide, but in 2021, we refreshed once again, made some important improvements to our strategy going forward. So that's a continual process. About every 3 years, we refresh our approach to food safety and our strategic goals. Next slide, please. So some insights I mentioned I would share with you. First, the commitments we've made, which you've heard about. Insights on Listeria control. These may not be new to many of you on the phone, but one thing I've learned in my career and challenges related to controlling the safety of ready-to-eat food. Of course, Listeria is one of the more important microbiological hazards that we have to stay focused on. There are some very simple concepts that deserve repeating, and I will bet that we'll hear some of this from Dr. Oliver in a few minutes. First of all, you have to have an aggressive environmental sampling program for food contact as well as non-food contact zones of your operating facility. You must have an aggressive approach to taking those samples. Simply sampling passively is not going to work. You have to test to find the organism. We know that it lurks in places that are hard to reach. So when I say aggressive environmental sampling program, I mean really using some elbow grease with our swab samples and our sponge sampling methods to get into places where Listeria is most likely to survive and persist. So that's super important. But going along with that aggressive sampling program, you must have an aggressive response to every positive result. Having a sampling program is of no value if you don't respond aggressively to every positive result. I can't say that enough. It's the #1 insight that I can share. I could stop there. And if everyone did that produces ready-to-eat food, we would have a safer food supply. It's hard to respond aggressively. We use the seek and destroy methodology. Our teams react quickly as soon as a positive result returns from the lab, whether it's food contact or non-food contact. We form a seek and destroy team, which is cross-functional. They dig in. They're required to come up with multiple hypotheses of what caused the positive and run each hypothesis to ground. And while we don't always find the true root cause, we work very hard to try to achieve that. So I've mentioned the Seek and Destroy teams have to be cross-functional across our manufacturing environment. So everyone's involved. It's not just the food safety team. It's not just the microbiologist. It's virtually every functional area of the business. The other key insights, two things that I wanted to share, which I think are well understood but simple and important to repeat, is that heat can be a very useful intervention, especially for equipment that's been identified as being high risk. So slicers or equipment that is hard to disassemble or hard to clean. We've effectively used heat in the form of steam to destroy any Listeria that may be has made it through the typical cleaning and sanitation process. So we frequently deploy the concept of tent steaming, where we cover the equipment, bring the internal temperature of the equipment up to a temperature that is lethal to anything on the surface of that equipment. We also use clean out of place tanks for small parts. We've used batch ovens to actually cook equipment where we don't have other ways to achieve a heat lethality on high-risk equipment. So heat is an important intervention step. Secondly, the formulation of our products or other manufacturing techniques that ensure that the product prevents the outgrowth of Listeria through the shelf life. Those are important concepts that need to be incorporated into ready-to-eat foods. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to end with some insights around leadership and how we embed food safety into our culture at Maple Leaf Foods. And I'll start with the ritual that we have. And rituals are important in leadership. Rituals remind us every day, and rituals are helpful to fight off complacency. So one of the things we do is an 8:30 call, which we started in September of 2008. Michael McCain set this call up. Every operational leader across our network of facilities had to be on that call at 8:30, and that didn't matter if your plant was in Vancouver or on the East Coast. Everybody was on at 8:30, and we talked about the results from the previous day. It turns out we've maintained that ritual since September of 2008. In fact, we had a call this morning that was fantastic. Was one of our prosciutto facility in Toronto gave an excellent presentation on an investigation they had done. So we continue the 8:30 call. Now today, it's either 2 or 3 times a week. And we use it as an opportunity to share learnings across our network. We typically have around 100 to 120 people on that call. We ask questions. The plants that have an issue or learned something, lessons learned, presentations are very useful, and we share those learnings across our network, and it's very helpful to drive performance. Our teams are very transparent with the results on those calls, which really helps. Next slide, please. We constantly think about complacency. It's a natural human trait to be complacent. You have to think about fighting it back. One of the ways we do that is making our results visual, talking about our lessons learned, talking about the data. On the left side of this chart, I'm not going to go into the detail, but this does reflect our food contact surface positives since the event in 2008. So this is a control chart that goes all the way back to September of 2008, where you can see our mean value was somewhere around 1% of our positives were positive for Listeria on food contact, down to a rate since 2015 of a very stable environment where we do find positives, but on a very infrequent basis. And our current mean across our network, and this data set would reflect hundreds of thousands of Listeria positive sample points. Today, we get 1 or 2 positives per year. So a very minimal positive rate, but every positive we get, we react to quickly, and we visualize that data on a regular basis. Next slide, please. The last really area I want to talk about is some of the things that we've learned, and I've covered some of this already, but leadership is critical to driving food safety culture and ensuring that things like Listeria control happen every day. You heard in the video our former CEO, Michael McCain, as well as our new CEO, Curtis Frank. The tone starts from the top, and the tone has to be clear. It has to be transparent. It has to hold people accountable, and it also has to be encouraging. And these things are important. The tone has to start from the top, and that's something that I've certainly learned. It does. Driving food safety culture requires a significant investment of resources, both human resources as well as, in certain places, capital and equipment and in facilities to drive change. And so maintaining proper investment in our food safety programs demonstrates a commitment which drives food safety culture. Third point is that it's not only about the tone from the top. And I want to really emphasize this, that the culture does have to come from the bottom up. People have to care. The people who handle our food every single day, who come to work in our facilities, whether they're manufacturing plants or retail or food service operations, they have to care. And it's important that leadership and management listens to every employee, and that every employee feels that they have a role and a voice in how food gets produced. And so while tone from the top is important, leadership from the top is important, there is just as equal a benefit for having engaged employees on the front lines. And so I've left here with a final question for all of you to take away and think about for your own, whatever organization you're in, on how you can find tools and actions that can help fight off complacency in the work that you do to ensure food safety. Next slide, please. I'll close with this remark, quote from Michael McCain at one of our commemoration events back in 2017. He frequently used this quote. He means it, and I've embraced it myself. The victims of the tragedy that we experienced in 2008 do have a right to move on, and we do not. And that's how we treat our commitment to food safety every single day. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Randy, for this inspirational talk and for providing a wonderful model, actually, for the food safety industry to ensure a safer food supply chain. Remember, actually, we will have our Q&A session after the second speaker, which I will give the floor now to my the other moderator for this session, Paul, actually, to introduce her, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Hanny. And thank you, Dr. Huffman, as well. I am very pleased now to introduce our next session speaker, Dr. Haley Oliver. The topic, enrichment and identification challenges among Listeria species from different environments. This session will address current challenges with Listeria detection, the complexities of the genus structure, and considerations for industry and regulatory agencies. I am very interested and looking forward to the insights we're going to gain today. So Dr. Haley Oliver is a 150th anniversary professor, and I did find out what that meant earlier today, and assistant dean for online programs in the College of Agriculture and the director of the USAID Feed the Future Food Safety Innovation Lab. As director of the Food Safety Innovation Lab, she develops and oversees USAID's food safety research portfolio, currently implemented in countries such as Senegal, Kenya, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nigeria, and Nepal. She has over 10 years of food security field experience in low and middle income economies. Dr. Oliver is doing so much to help so many others in food safety around the world. Her domestic research focuses on foodborne pathogens in emerging food systems, such as cellular agriculture. And there are a lot of emerging food systems out there. So it's great that she's doing this with an emphasis on practical and feasible control strategies. And again, thank you for practical and feasible strategies. Dr. Oliver, at this point, I am very happy to pass the microphone over to you. And Michelle is going to put your slides up right now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Hanny, for the invitation and to the tremendous backside support to ensure that this 150, not quite 150-year-old yet, professor makes it on time to this really important event to celebrate 20 years of this, which is really exciting. And of course, it's always an inherent challenge to follow Dr. Randy Huffman, but I'm here to get into the weeds with you on the expansion of the definition of Listeria in the past couple of years. That in the next slide I fully own, and as you heard from the other things that take my time these days, this is really the work of many people, but including on the next slide, it should showcase Catherine Carlin and Martin Weidman, really who have advanced our understanding of the definition of Listeria as a genus. And I think have really set the stage for deeper discussions on what does Listeria mean. We know that not all Listeria are created equal, and we have detection platforms that might find them all or find most of them, but we have to question what that really means. Next slide, please. Thanks, Michelle. So the Listeria genus structure has really been evolving, and this is a snapshot of it from 2009 and really reflective of our understanding of it through 2016. But you could see that right there represented in the top section of this phylogenetic tree are our classic 6, or what I like to say, back in the day when I was in grad school, which was in this time frame, we really thought about Listeria as 6 species: Monocytogenes, Marthii, Inocua, Welshemeri, Ivanovii, Salibri. And yes, in the context of those other near-related genuses and species, but the definition and our understanding of organisms that are Listeria or closely related to Listeria monocytogenes has really grown, even in the past 3 years. Next slide, please. So why is this frustrating, or what are some of the barriers that we have at the moment? We don't have a specific, as long as we've been using this word genus, we still don't have an inclusive versus exclusive definition of what a genus is. And so it's difficult to actually delineate what a bacterial genera actually is. And so there's a number of approaches that have been proposed, including amino acid identity or percent identity of the 16S rRNA gene, which is very commonly used, as is the average nucleotide identity. But again, there's no concrete yes or no, or this is the way to do it at this point in time. Next slide, please. So again, this is what I love about this history is I can benchmark a number of my life events on it. I was born in 1982, and so I'm right at after the edge there of the really identifying Listeria monocytogenes as a foodborne pathogen. And little did I know that even though we emerged really at the same time, that I would spend the next 20 years thinking about it, even as an undergraduate at the University of Wyoming, trying to look at some of the roles that genes play in what makes Listeria monocytogenes a pathogen. And so I got to live through my graduate school years up through 2009. It's like the slide was built for me. Thinking about really Listeria as 6 species, but what we know today, it has wildly expanded, greatly due to the work of Dr. Martin Weidman's lab, and a lab that I am associated with from graduate school and as postdoc, have expanded our definition of those organisms. And you'll see with many of these species, they were identified in mass, so multiple organisms per year. And these really come from the Weidman Lab's energy looking at Listeria broadly from many different environments. That could be from produce environments, agriculture fields, animal production systems, to what we call native environments. So what is Listeria, well, like I like to say, out in the wild, so in pristine environments, just the Finger Lakes National Forest. I'll never forget, I'm going to tell this very brief story about looking for Listeria in the Finger Lakes National Forest. We believe in training undergraduates while we're in graduate school to kind of keep that pipeline of talent built. It was when I actually came across what were called the rainbow people out in the Finger Lakes National Forest, and it turns out it was a nudist colony. So it really brought a whole new lens to our sampling experience there out in upstate New York. But part of that study, right? I mean, why not? Here we go. But it was part of the study that expanded our understanding of the differences in Listeria species that are out there, at least for our definition of the genus. Next slide, please. Again, unforgettable. I was so glad to have sunglasses with me that day. Not everybody did, and I've been an avid sunglass wearer ever since when it comes to field sampling. So why did these new species occur? Again, I mentioned there was a large expansion in us trying to look at where Listeria could be coming from so we can have a better understanding of how to control it. And obviously, Randy and his team have been thinking about this for years, of how do you control it within their plants, within their facilities, but also from incoming product. How do we keep this organism at bay? We're not eliminating it from the planet. It's not going to go away. It's a saprophyte. It's with us, but we do have strategies, effective strategies to control it, and we do, through these expanded studies, better understand where they come from. SIGB, which is a gene near and dear to my heart from my time in graduate school, is a really reliable subtyping tool. It's a gene that's found across the organisms that we can use as a strategy to have a better understanding of which species we might be identifying. Obviously, advances in whole genome sequencing have made tremendous strides in our understanding of Listeria, but also have effectively, while it looks as though there are more identified outbreaks of listeriosis, the good news is that they're smaller. We're identifying challenges faster, understanding the relationship between clinical isolates and food isolates or potential food sources, so we can stop those outbreaks from becoming larger. And of course, whole genome sequencing has become more high throughput, more cost effective. And if you have studied whole genome sequencing or it's a part of your life in any way, Listeria was really kind of the test case for the transition from other technologies into what is now the gold standard of whole genome sequencing, because Listeria is a smaller genome, but it's also synthetic, which means the genes are usually in the same order. It's a stable genome. So it was a great test case for us to launch this technology to improve food safety, identify outbreaks, and to slow and to reduce the exposure to other individuals. So next slide, please. So again, that expansion of 6 to 28, a number of those, the vast majority really, came from Martin Wiedman's group, as I mentioned. And these were found using a really standard approach for Listeria detection. We were, again, out in multiple environments, these studies, using a modified FDA BAM method. So nothing really fancy about that Listeria detection method, but it does include enrichment, where those enrichments were then would have been plated on modified Oxford medium, looking for typical and atypical colonies, and then taking those colonies and SIGB allelic type sequencing them to better understand which Listeria species might be there. But of course, that lab is very much a leader in whole genome sequencing and really was pinnacle to advancing whole genome sequencing and Listeria. And so the ANI approach is now really the gold standard that they use for novel species detection. So anything that has a value less than 95, so less than 95% identity, would be defined as a different species. So, next slide, please. All right, so what do we know about these recently detected, now 22 species? Is we don't have any evidence that there's pathogens within those discoveries. So your immediate sense is, well, why are we talking about this? Well, because it complicates detection. And it can complicate some of our decision making on how we react to a Listeria positive in our environment. unintentionally, I would say, muddies the water on how we make a decision. I appreciate what the maple leaf approach is if you find Listeria, it's seek and destroy, you take action. That's completely rational, functional, effective strategy. If you're using, if that isn't your approach, one, we'd encourage you to adopt that approach. But again, you might not have enough information to make the most informed decision if you're not treating all Listeria as monocytogeny. So I do very much champion the point. These species aren't new. We just are just now detecting them. And I think you can argue that's the case for why have we not reduced foodborne illness? At least I can speak to some of the United States context. Well, we're better at detecting them. We're better at understanding outbreaks. We're better at identifying the pathogens that can cause those diseases. So the power of data is very much, can be clouded by not great news. But as pointed out from those studies in my interface with the nudist colony and the rainbow people, they're coming from natural environments. But we know that our inputs or some of our products obviously come from agriculture and natural environments, and so they can find their way into our food manufacturing systems. But we have found some of those more unique species in ready-to-eat meats and dairies and processing environments. So again, we have to question what our detection systems can or cannot differentiate. Next slide, please. All right, so when it comes to the phylogenetic structure of the Listeria species that we have at least identified today. Next slide, please. They really fall into two clades, and that's sensu stricto and sensu lato, where, again, prior, back in Haley Oliver in graduate school days, there were two informal groups, and that was the 5 listed and then Listeria grayi. But really with the expansion and definition of or identification of more Listeria species, they're falling into two clades, and that's stricto and lato, where stricto are the ones we're encouraging people to put more energy behind and thought behind, because those are more similar to Listeria monocytogenes. And so I think on the next slide, it will highlight that, you know, the people that have really been doing the great work of better understanding the Listeria structure, next slide, please, have proposed redefining the genre. So trying to break apart these sensu lato away from renaming. Let's not call them Listeria, for example. There's been energy put in behind that because they really have no evidence of a public health risk, but not yet successful in that pursuit. But the sensu lato, again, those that are not as closely related to Listeria monocytogenes, our foodborne pathogen, they are phenotypically different. So they don't rot refrigeration temperatures, they're non-modal, and they don't reduce nitrate, which are really hallmark traits of Listeria monocytogenes and Listeria sensu stricto. So next slide, please. Again, this is a great visual representation from Carlin et al. In 2021, where you can see the major differentiation between sensu stricto and sensu lato using the ANI definition and 16S. They looked at it using multiple criteria, but that 95% cutoff, identity cutoff, we find that sensu stricto really does fall into its own clade. And again, I think strong evidence, and they will continue to be adding to this evidence, no doubt, that there's a case to be made to redefine and not perhaps label the Listeria sensu lato as Listeria. Next slide, please. All right, so again, just some more by the numbers. When we look at the percent ANI values, you can see that the ones that are closest to Listeria monocytogenes are Listeria marthii, Corsortiae, and Swaminathanii. Boy, and you know what is missing from this list is we don't have a Huffmanii and we don't have an Oliverio. Randy and I have not arrived at the point where we have our own species named after us, but we can remain hopeful. But if you know anything about the history of Listeria, the history of the naming actually showcase the number of people that have spent careers understanding these organisms and that have really moved the needle on public health for them. So again, I hope that someday I can be on that honored list. So again, and the bottom line here is that sensu lato are genetically and phenotypically different from Listeria monocytogenes, but the challenge remains of whether or not the detection system or platforms that you're using are including or excluding them. Next slide, please. All right. I think next slide, please. We've kind of really covered most of this, unless there's a click. There we go. All right. So again, as we've seen, I think it's important to take a look at this visually, again, if you're in the weeds with me on sensu stricto and sensu lato, of when it is that we discovered those that are more closely related to Listeria monocytogenes and therefore more likely to be picked up with the Listeria monocytogenes targeted detection systems. You'll find that, again, 4 of those that fall into the stricto category were discovered post-2021. So I'm curious what the future will look like and how this continues to evolve to, I would say, complicate the Listeria story. But what we've found, proportionately, is that most of the organisms, Listeria, that have been discovered fall into sensu lato, which again, not evidence for public health risk, nor is there much risk, nor is that to suggest that among those species within stricto have been defined with public health risk either. They just happen to be genetically more similar and complicates our detection strategies. Next slide, please. All right, so how do they impact our index organisms? And I think that's really kind of the key question. Next slide, please. Important to, I think, highlight the difference between indicator organisms and index organisms. I think, like verification and validation, we sometimes intermix these two terms. I have this ongoing list of things that I probably need to just get tattooed on my arm for reference, validation, verification, difference, those terms being one of them, but maybe indicator and index organisms fall into that category as well. But to highlight indicator organisms, their presence provides an indication of microbial condition of the environment. It does not say that there's a strong association between that organism and a foodborne pathogen. So it's a bigger sphere of inclusion. We could think about it that way compared to an index organism, which when we think about, again, this Listeria context, it's Listeria species are the only ones that truly qualify as index organisms. And they are the ones that suggest that conditions of the environment where you're doing your testing are sufficient that could also support the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. And really, this is the basis for the philosophy of why Listeria testing and not necessarily Listeria monocytogenes testing, so Listeria species testing, is a very viable approach to a Listeria control program. But back to Randy's point, only if you treat every Listeria positive with absolute due diligence. Next slide, please. So the question then comes into call of, are the 26 new Listeria, or comprehensively, where do the species land in this idea of index organisms? And I think Carlin and Weidman strongly argue, and I think more prevalence data is still needed, but it's likely that those organisms that fall into sensu stricto, which again are listed there on the left, really should be the ones that we would argue, should be the ones that are considered the index organisms, whereas the ever-growing list of sensu lato don't necessarily meet the functional inclusion criteria for being an index organism. Next slide, please. All right, so what are the ramifications for our detection platforms? Next slide, please. At the end of the day, we're going to need more data, and of course, FDA, USDA, and Health Canada are diligently considering this, but regulatory strategy at the moment, unless something has changed in the last couple of weeks, still currently mention the original 6. So Cellular Welshimeri, Gray Eye, Ivanovii, Inocua, monocytogenes. But the data for expanded species obviously really began in 2010, a major expansion in 2016, and ISO has given them a nod of at least 11 of them as of 2016. Next slide, please. So We have to consider the ramifications of this expanded definition of Listeria, or the new species added for our reference, within the reference methods for rapid detection or rapid method validation studies. So if you are in the business of developing platforms or have the responsibility of selecting the detection platforms for your company, knowing to ask whether your service provider, what reference organisms they've used and what those platforms have been validated against is really quite key. There's still a lot of data that is needed on the new species. What we don't have, for a number of our rapid method positives, we're not able to define atypical morphology if you're using rapid methods. A lot of the expected biochemical results for the tests for Listeria species are really not well described. And again, our sensu lato, those are far away from monocytogenies, can have typical morphology. So they can look like our Listeria monocytogenies, or our called big six of the Listeria land. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a public health threat. So next slide, please. As far as rapid detection methods, modal species, they're still going to be detected by antigen antibody-based methods. Real-time PCR, very likely that the sensu stricta are going to be detected, but it's also very platform specific. It depends on what the gene targets or the proprietary targets in many cases actually are. So inclusion and exclusion, asking your provider, again, of these platforms to be able to differentiate that. Prove to me is what I would be saying. Again, I live in academia, so maybe not the real world, but I'd be saying, I'd like to know what the data look like, and proprietary or not, I'd like to know what your platform says about inclusion or exclusion of sensu lato. Again, we're not seeing Listeria, all of the new Listeria represented in comparative databases. And so that's obviously really important for better understanding which Listeria you have. Of course, we're championing that you're sequencing those to better understand them, which, again, populating databases is really what makes whole genome sequencing as powerful as it can be. Next slide, please. All right, so what should we do? What can we do today? Next slide. Our current test detection methods, they're going to work with all the Listeria species, but even in the systems that we have the possibility of false positives with Listeria. And so, again, I encourage you, I challenge you to challenge your system by requesting data on the assay specificity. What is included, what is excluded, and what's the confidence in that data. If you're not in the business of whole genome sequencing yet, this is a clear opportunity to confirm Listeria species versus monocytogenies. Again, there's deep-rooted philosophies on Listeria species testing versus differentiating to monocytogenies, or even embracing whole genome sequencing. And I respect that industry and private sector land in the continuum of these philosophies, but still the tools remain that can actually answer the questions of whether or not your organism is monocytogenes or not. We still have many layers to that genome level data or nucleotide level data to define species. So whether it's computational approaches for identification, average nucleotide identity, which we've really already talked about, that ANI, could be in silico hybridization, or genome taxonomy data toolkit. We still have to have structural ways of defining inclusion or exclusion, or defining that species, which again, back to that early slide, we don't have a consistent definition even of genus. So the more data we have, the more informed decisions that we can actually make on defining a species and defining whether it should be sensu lato, sensu, or stricto, and the ramifications really for detection and public health. Next slide, please. So the main takeaway here, Listeria, it does group into really the two major clades of sensu strictum and sensu lato, and it's the sensu lato that are the most distant from Listeria monocytogenes, championing the idea of maybe it's doesn't meet the definition of Listeria, which could then put those species to rest when it comes to future or potential regulatory interpretation. We have a diverse range of Listeria species, which of course is going to challenge our detection methods. And that's classical, obviously, but also our rapid detection methods. I've already mentioned again, championing, get the Sensulato, give it a new name, and that would probably clear up some of the challenges here. But if you're in practice, if you're in the private sector or in actually using these tests, Listeria species tests, false positives and false negatives are what are going to keep you up at night. And so understanding inclusion and exclusion with your platforms against what is now a very wide range of Listeria species is pretty mission critical. So next slide, please. All right, yeah, again, I highlight the people who have done, the boots on the ground work of better understanding and characterizing Listeria species. Catherine, Carlin, Martin Weidman, Renato Orsi, who, my goodness, we've worked with these people for so many years, but are the true leaders in understanding Listeria as a whole, but also how technologies such as whole genome sequencing advance our understanding of them. Happy to take any questions with Randy. Historically, my work, I work in post-manufacturing. My group's work in Listeria looks at retail challenges, where I was so happy to, of course, Randy says the things that are always, we can prove it with data, the things he said, such as, I can design you a testing scheme, an environmental monitoring program where you never find Listeria. That's not a great choice. I think what we've seen working in manufacturing and retail now is that behavior is key. And putting the investment and buy-in from the bottom up and from the top down, we see that in retail as well. So again, always hard to follow Randy, but happy to take any questions from our work in retail or also on the future of Listeria testing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oliver. I see that Randy is back. And okay, what's really difficult to do is for Hanny and me to follow both of you and try to sound as engaging and as informative. That's the real challenge.
I think we'll just need to find that nudist group. You'll be right up to speed. It was the wildest experience ever. Some things from grad school you don't forget.
Nice. And Haley, you mentioned tattoos. I've got a good tattoo artist in Guelph. If you're ever up here, you want to tattoo validation versus verification?
There's so many of those. And the further honestly, the further I get from the lab in my faculty responsibilities, the more tattoos I'm going to have is the bottom line.
There you go. So the questions have started to roll in a little bit. So let me look at the first one here. And I believe this one would be for Haley. Have Sensulato species been detected in clinical samples from ill persons?
No, they have not, to my knowledge. No. So again, the frustration is if our Listeria detection systems say, yes, we have a Listeria challenge, not necessarily monocytogenes, not necessarily a public health risk. So why, we argue that there's a need for a greater differentiation, but no, nothing in the clinical side.
In clinical side. I think there's a follow-up question related to that, so I'll just skip over Randy's. Adding to this, have they and frequency been found in food processing facilities in environmental sampling?
Yeah, some of them have been found in processing environments, but I think what you would see across all of these species is many of them are rare. And so they're not often found in these environments, and some environments that we would consider quite removed from food and food processing. And so the likelihood of finding them is low, but knowing that they're there and trying to capture the complication that they can add to detection is kind of the importance of them. And I yield the floor to Randy if he has anything to add about kind of, we'll call them the fringe Listeria.
No, I don't. I found your presentation really insightful. Our methodologies are anchored in sort of the traditional methodologies that are recognized by both in Canada and the U.S. And so we haven't explored that much, as you know. We are just beginning to implement whole genome sequencing in our normal processes, which is primarily around significant investigations where finding root cause has proved challenging using simple Listeria genus testing. And where we know that we want to dig deeper, so we have begun to use more advanced molecular methods, but I can't say that we've uncovered anything that's insightful on that question. So, but maybe in the future we will.
A bit of a follow-up question to this from a selfish perspective. I look at deli slicers in retail settings. So I guess what both of you said certain things that really triggered additional deli slicer questions in me. So, Randy, you were talking about steam and heat, which might not be necessarily suitable in a supermarket deli area. But I'm wondering, from both your perspectives, what can a supermarket deli area do to ensure that the deli slicer doesn't become a source of Listeria contamination?
I'm going to let Dr. Oliver answer that, because I know she spent a significant amount of time in major retail operations in the U.S. several years ago studying that question. So I think I'm going to defer to her.
Yeah, wow. I was like, how much time do we have? For the slicers, when we look at our prevalence data for Listeria, we tested for monocytogenes. Well, we tested for all, but we did speciate, first of all, to monocytogenes. And I think the thing I will say about, at least in our studies, we found that the vast majority of the isolates were monocytogenes and not other Listeria species. The prevalence on slicers was low. We didn't often find it there, but obviously we know there's been a tremendous body of work on transmission and challenges with slicers themselves. But the environment itself, the prevalence was extraordinarily high, ranging from 0, which were great, and we're very curious, obviously. We remained curious about those facilities, but also 30% of our samples were positive in others. And when it's 30%, yes, I worry about the slicer, but I worry about the bigger picture there as well. I think we have, it might have been Ecolab's work that said it's 19 minutes to clean and sanitize a slicer. And if you have a bank of, and I bet that's optimistic, because those are, even with the energy that's gone into improving hygienic design, they're still complicated. And they still scare me, because I have a fear of short things. I'll own it. That's okay. So the time that it takes to clean them, if we're trying to hold to that 4-hour frequency, which again, does that happen, is a whole nother discussion. Finding ways to make them faster, safer, easier to clean remains a thing. Good data that supports separating deli meats from other products, so dedicated slicers for meats, for cheeses, seem to still show up as a significant, positively significant way to control Listeria in the environment. But I could go on and on, but it's collectively the whole and design. And again, if you want to get into the behavior piece, we have a paper that someday will be published. It's a weird one because it's an economics paper looking at census, U.S. Census tract data of what about the population and where the grocery store is and the Listeria monocytogenes prevalence can I tie together? Well, guess what it comes out as the significant predictor of whether a store will have high Listeria? Income. So the poorer or the lower the income in a region where that store is located, zip code or U.S. Census tract data, the more likely that store is to have Listeria monocytogenes positives. Does that track mentally with what we see? Yes, we asked the question because here I am in what were clearly challenging parts of cities across the United States and said, okay, I see my environment around me and then I see my Listeria data. What is it? And so we can tie it back to income. And that probably is driven then by a return on investment in the infrastructure of the store. My hypothesis is if that's a low yielding, if you don't have big revenue from that store, it's really hard to get motivated for capital investment. And maybe you have challenges with labor, people working multiple jobs. We can layer in a lot of socioeconomic questions. Sorry, yes, this is beyond your slicer, but I don't think the slicer is your biggest war to retail. That's the end of my manifesto.
Wow, we have so many public health colleagues on the call as well. So just looking at food safety from a health equities lens, just speaks to what you're talking about right there as well. So
yeah,
thank you. Yeah, can I have my own question just as the follow-up to that, the retail deli challenge, slicers and other equipment in the retail deli. Haley, I don't know if you're intimately involved, but I do know that USDA FSIS put out a guidance document on best practices for controlling LM in retail delicatessens. It was published in 2015. I've wondered if that is still current, and is it due for, I think that's the most recent version, unless I missed something more recent.
Something else.
Is it due for a refresh, and are there learnings that could be added to that document? It's been a while since I read it, but I do know that's the one thing I've seen published that's somewhat specific about the advice and the question you had, Paul.
Yeah. Wow, Randy, I would hedge it probably. I don't know that there's any, earth-shattering new news into that guidance. There was another piece, and I apologize for not knowing exactly when it was published. We did not oversee that, or were not asked to comment on that guidance.
Okay.
But there was one piece that rolled out, I think after that, unless time has escaped me, that did champion sanitizer rotation, and there was reasonably so pushback on that because there is no data to support that has utility, but it was in the guidance. And so we wouldn't have supported that. The other thing kind of in that vein is, we don't have evidence of Listeria sanitizer resistance. That word gets kicked around a lot. You can get past me with the word tolerance because we know there's quat, resistance genes, but we have no evidence that the Listeria itself can actually resist, 200 parts per million quat like that. I've tried to crawl Listeria. I've done low dose, slow exposure of different sanitizers and quats. We can't get it past, I think, 12.5 parts per million, at least in a lab setting. So again, there's some hesitation there.
And just to take it back to the new species that just you presented right now, do you guys think that there could be a challenge in validation studies? There could be a difference in the post-processing actually treatment among those species to control Listeria? We are talking about detection, so what about controlling Listeria, putting in our mind the new species that are now being detected?
Yeah, Hanny, that's a good question. So if I think I'll rebox your question and you can tell me if I pulled an academic move and really disregarded it. You're saying, do these organisms have maybe enhanced ability to survive our typical? I don't think we have any data. I don't think there's data to support that at this time. I also don't know how much energy has been put into evaluating that. Yeah. My hypothesis would be is that they're no different.
Okay.
If not worse, or more sensitive to some of our control strategies.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go down to the next. It's actually a question from Randy. When going through Listeria control insights, are you able to disclose what Listeria inhibitors or Listeria growth preventers are being used in the formulation, or sorry, the formation of the product?
Yeah, it's a good question. Years ago, that would have been easier and more precise to answer. back in 2009-10. We converted over 1,400 of our ready-to-eat product SKUs or shopkeeping units. 1,400 were converted to contain a combination of lactate and diacetate. And that was the predominant inhibitor at that time, 15 years ago, quite successfully implemented, across North America in ready-to-eat meat products specifically, and other ready-to-eat foods. And that can be very effective, and there's a publicly available model that can be used to plug in the intrinsic and extrinsic factors and get a growth prediction that's quite reliable. And so that forms the basis of the work that we've done at Maple Leaf. However, consumers have changed, if you haven't noticed, over the years, and demands for simpler labels, simpler ingredient statements that reflect ingredients that consumers are comfortable with. That's been a push, and so we've moved to more natural components, with the requirement for our product development teams that whatever unique and innovative and novel inhibitors we can deploy, they have to be proven through the standard modeling techniques. And we use, I don't think it's a secret, we use the Corbion model, was called the Purac model way back in the day. It's been published, and we still rely on that, a quite conservative approach. So whatever natural inhibitor we may use, and I see in the questions as well, there's a suggestion of a pediucin-based, which I'm not familiar with, so I apologize. So thanks for sharing that in the chat. But we are more open to identifying ingredients that fit sort of the definition of understandable by consumers, like quote unquote natural ingredients or processes. Of course, we have some products that rely on water activity and pH as natural inhibitors, things such as prosciutto, or dry cured salamis and dry cured products that have that are shelf stable and have intrinsic factors that prevent growth through the shelf life. There are multiple ways to get there, but our goal is to ensure that the product is formulated to not exhibit more than 2 log growth during the shelf life. Hope that
Thank
helps.
you. It helps me. I'm sure it helps the person asking. And
I think it's super important for that previous question about when products get re-exposed to a ready-to-eat environment, either in a restaurant, which we've seen a growing interest in slicing deli meats in a fast food restaurant setting. I think everybody is familiar with what's happening there, and as well as in traditional retail environments. Having the product be formulated provides at least some additional safety net when that product is re-exposed.
Right. I learned that 10 years ago, actually, from a Maple Leaf Food sales leader who talked about the challenges once the RT product leaves the control of the refrigerator. And it 'tis the season for catering. So, catering and these RT products are going to sit in somebody's living room as they're shared with family for hours and hours potentially. So I think your point and the risk is very, very germane.
I think if there's there's many hills to die on, but one of them is definitely differentiating safety and quality, and to your point of the expanded interest in slicing post manufacturing. We step back and we ask, why is that? And it's because there is this perception that is a higher quality product. We know who made the product. Man,
Danny DeVito hasn't helped us any on this one.
He hasn't.
No. I like his movies, but I wish, anyways, we won't talk about that.
We could stop that part.
Rolling down the list of questions. Interesting. Sorry.
I think retail. They've really have a much better understanding of the challenge of Listeria in their environments now, though. Like if we go back to kind of the pinnacle work on post-manufacturing in 2009 and where retailers are now, it's very different. And the discussions I have with them are very different. We have people testing for Listeria, they're looking. And so the awareness has changed. That is not to discourage, you know, slicing post-manufacturing, because the bar and the perception has changed. But it's when we have new people entering this market that maybe don't have that historical knowledge or understanding the risk. That's where that's the space I worry.
For sure. And let's face it, we also have a proliferation of home-based businesses as well. So now how do we educate them on the hazards, and what can we do upstream to help them perhaps?
Definitely.
So, okay. It's funny, before we started speaking, I mentioned you guys, oh, you know, we might not go the full 30 minutes with questions. I think we might need another 30 minutes to go through all of them. I'm moving on to the next one here. Another question for Randy. We at Inodal have developed a solution. Sorry?
I think Randy has responded to that, yes.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I referenced that one. Thanks for, I think that I'm on the website now, just checking it out. So thank you for sharing.
Good.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. And I understand from the presentation that sensu stricto are better index organisms for El Mono, but they also have not been cause of disease. Is this correct?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Oh, this is a pivotal question, because they start by saying, good question from Paul. So I'll take any, any good I can get on deli counter slicers. What is the best suggestion to public health inspectors for inspections? For example, swabs. And that is a great question, JC.
If the question is to retail or to restaurants.
So I think it's for, so public health inspectors who are out inspecting retail, deli, the entire area, not just focusing on the deli slicer. Any advice on the questions they should be asking, things they should be looking at? Should they be taking swabs? What do you suggest?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think the short answer to that is when I look again at the distribution of delis, we've been delis and produce environments. So we've looked at retail produce as well. So probably north of 150 stores across the US. I will say I don't have to test for Listeria in the stores that have a problem. Like I wouldn't put my resources into testing. Randy, I mean, would you?
Yeah.
I think the story is critical for your world. But I think we have, if I look at, you know, the challenging 30%, the issue is baseline sanitation. You know, the environment's not clean, it's cluttered, it's not cleanable. I don't need to test.
I think I agree 100%. The basis for that, from my perspective, is one of it's a practical approach based on science, which would be, Haley, you've gone out and done very aggressive sampling. You've published that in retail delis. It shows it can be as high as 30%. If that's true, if you can just practically apply that to anywhere there's a retail deli slicer or in a food service operation, if it could be 30% based on your sampling, when I would walk into a deli, I would just assume that it is positive. Like that's so high, that is so high that you just have to assume they're all positive. And then you have to look at the basics of sanitation and the control practices on segregating raw and ready to eat in those delis. I think that would be much more valuable than taking a swab.
Yep.
The swab, because, and I emphasize this with my team testing for anything. You never take a test for something unless you know exactly what you're going to do with that information and how it's going to change your behavior and how you're going to make a different decision because of it. And from my perspective, I would simply assume that there's a good chance Listeria is going to be present in a refrigerated, ready-to-eat environment like that, and then evaluate the basic principles and practices of GMPs sanitation and cleanliness, and we have to do our best. That the other, sort of practical guidance I apply there is, fortunately, those products hopefully aren't stored very long. They're typically consumed rather quickly. And so if they're recontaminated at that level, it's very unlikely that they're going to be very long shelf life products, right? They're going to be relatively short periods of time, measured in hours or days, not weeks and months. And so when I produce something in one of my factories, I've got very long shelf life, very, very long. I'm measured in weeks and months, not in hours and days. And so, that is a factor in how you'd approach managing that from a public health standpoint. That'd be my perspective, that simply using our core senses of sight, touch, smell will be far more effective than taking a swab. So long answer to a short, easy question.
And I'll back it up with using a tool of data. Like we armed some retail grocery stores with ATP monitors at no cost to them, because it was kind of a social experiment and it worked. Like I got the answer I expected, but also to use that ATP data to look at relationships with Listeria prevalence. They are not the same, but to see if there was a relationship. The stores that had the biggest Listeria challenges didn't even use the technology. So it's not even like you couldn't even use that, gamification in a way to actually move the needle. So yeah, use your sense of sight and smell, and honestly, you'll be on your way.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. We are at our last minute, just being respectful of everybody's time. There was one final question. You're interested in knowing if we all eat RTE deli meat. I'm going to say yes, I do. I'm also not a high-risk person. I mean, if I were part of the high-risk population, I might want to take another precaution, but I do have no problem. It's a voluntary question.
I'd answer the same way, 100%. If I have a friend who's pregnant or otherwise immune compromised or elderly, my father is 92 years old. I ask him, he loves deli meats. He's consumed them his whole life. He is now in a high-risk population. He understands that. So I encourage him to only purchase products from manufacturers that I know. And if he can only purchase ones from my company, I would recommend that. But he lives down in Alabama, a little harder to get our products there. But I would discourage him from purchasing, at a self-serve deli for the reasons we've just talked about. Yeah, it's a good question. So it's an honest question. Thank you.
Yeah, what's your answer, Hanny?
Yeah, for sure. The same answer, actually. You have high risk, actually just take extra precaution. Just make sure that you're getting it off from a good source, make sure of the shelf life, label, the condition, all that. But normally I love deli meat, so.
Well, but let's look at the trend data too, right? What are the causes, what are the leading or emerging leading causes of listeriosis?
Yeah.
Not necessarily RTE.
Well, we don't
Okay.
have time, but I did mention that we at Maple Leaf we purchased 2 companies in the U.S. and that make alternative protein products, so non-meat, ready-to-eat non-meat products that are sold throughout the United States and growing in Canada. And when we purchased those facilities, they had significant challenges in how they managed the ready-to-eat environment. Very significant challenges, and these were both businesses that had been in place for over 15, 20 years producing food. And honestly, if you asked me that question about food coming from those 2 plants when we acquired them, I would pause significantly. I would have a concern. And that's a reflection of what, Paul, your point earlier, there are all kinds of operations happening today, even catering in the home. We have to realize there are hazards and risks, and it's not just about meat. My point there is these were non-meat facilities, never seen. And we proved with data that they had significant problems, and we fixed them. And it took a lot of effort, a lot of capital investment, and a lot of changing the way people did their work. We're very proud of those facilities today, by the way, very proud. In fact, we published a story, an article on that about 2 years ago that you might want to read sometime. Happy to put a link to it in there.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
And as a proud Canadian, I'm proud of Maple Leaf Foods and everything that you're doing. Absolutely. It's part of Canadian heritage and culture as far as I'm concerned. So thank you. Okay, so that concludes our 4th session. We hope that everybody who's out there listening has enjoyed this final of 4 virtual symposium sessions. Or in the future, because this has been recorded, many of you will be seeing the recorded version, so we hope that you have also enjoyed this. Thank you, Dr. Huffman and Dr. Oliver, again. Of course, we indeed can never forget the devastating consequences of foodborne illness, so it is important to sometimes sit in the bruise and reflect on how horrible it can be. Also, the roles that we play with prevention, detection, aggressive detection and aggressive prevention. Thank you, Randy, for that. Education, inspection, and management. Today's session also touched on concepts of culture, continuous improvement as well. I think those are critical because, hey, risks evolve. And as risks evolve, if we stay status quo, that means we're falling behind and the risks are going to win. So I challenge everybody listening to this to go out there today, do one thing that is aggressive in being in your systems and in improving things. Be aggressive today. One thing. We have also hoped that you enjoyed the other 3 sessions in our 20th symposium. Want to thank all the speakers from all the sessions. Sharing your time and your expertise has been incredible. Also to thank the GFSS organizing committee for all their hard work and persistence and ingenuity. Also want to thank our fearless leader, Susan Sabatini, our fearless and persistent leader for herding the cats and keeping us through to today. These symposiums would not be possible without her. So once again, thank you all. Stay safe. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.